So here we get to some fancy visual effects that has to do with models and technology and rigging and virtual reality, simulators and so forth. And I think that some visual effects breakthroughs were created here and credited elsewhere. The Lunar rover appeared to move quite a distance across the moon's surface. Kilometers, several, 27 kilometers I believe it was. There's a graph later that shows you more, and simulator technology is used. It's been around for ages. Here are very simplistic versions. Someone moves the prop while they're in it, and there's a fancy version, a jet simulator. And here's a mock-up I did of how the lunar simulator was created. This is a lunar rover simulator. There's some footage there. I think it was created on this simulator. Basically, a model was filmed and the astronauts are put in the rig that mimic the movements, and the camera was on the rig and filmed the footage in the background or in front of the fake lunar module. Here is a setup of the model under the snorkel lens. And there, I think it was a DAC camera. It was filmed in very low frame, so it's crappy. And it's possible the lunar rover was animated. Here are some examples from the early 1970s. This is Don Dykstra, who was a student of Douglas Trumbull. And in the summary I went over this. I find this extraordinary every time I see it. I find it extraordinary how real it looks, and how tiny the models were used to generate it. It just blows my mind. Look at this snorkel camera. This is it moving across a tiny fake road set and creating something incredibly realistic in this low-resolution footage. There's the rig, the camera rig. It's called motion control. It's used extensively in visual effects today, and this was used to create city planning or something. I don't know how much he got paid to do this, but it's an extraordinary setup. And the time it must have took to build these models, I don't know. I don't know how long it took the team to build and record this, but it's extraordinary nevertheless, especially when you get to the nature footage in the end. You see the mountain in the background. This is with atmosphere and everything. You can imagine with the moon set how realistic, and you made it 3 times as big as that. This is a flight simulator camera, sideways pointing at a fake landscape, and moved in real time based on the pilot's action. They actually used it for Apollo training. This is the moon surface, model moon surface. There's a camera that moves along it based on the decisions of the astronauts. And this is a lunar rover simulator. I went over this in the summary, but this really fascinates me. They actually had the same setup. It's just like a flight simulator, except for a rover. There it is. I believe the camera is upside down or sideways. It's hard to tell here, depending on what they thought worked best. Here, a couple of astronauts coming to enjoy their simulation ride. How this helps them, I'm not sure, other than planning the ride and getting used to it. But if you look at the footage, it's truly amazing what's going on there. The camera is reaching, in basic ways, to the surface. The other thing to keep in mind is all of this is recordable, meaning not the footage generated, but the camera moves. That's the motion control. That's what motion control is. You create a camera view, re-record it in the computer, you can reproduce it again and again and again. And so you can turn the camera to the left, turn the camera to the right, turn it behind you, and do some passes. And you can do it frame by frame. You can do 1 frame every 2 seconds, 1 frame every 4 seconds, however it works best for you to generate the imagery. The camera moves forward, takes a new picture, moves forward, takes a new picture. This is another simulator. They call it the LOLA. This is footage generated from a model, and they have a camera rig set up. Although you'll see I speed it up. This is like their speed, and I sped it up so that we don't have to sit there and fall asleep. There, you just saw it speed up. You'll find when you look at the landing footage later, it's very similar to this when I speed it up. You know, this doesn't look as real as the other footage does, but they did a more sophisticated implementation. Here's that setup I show in the summary. Tracks, cameras on tracks, it's all computer controlled. It starts with a model and so forth. Here they are with their calipers. They like taking pictures with calipers on these things, and they've got their accurate mapping. They're making sure that the model matches accurately to the mapping because the astronauts are relying on it. They're the ones making these decisions that need to be completely oriented for their landing, right? And this is a simple mock-up of something on glass I showed because I found it a little funny. That's how they did it. They did it much more sophisticated for the hoax. This is huge. There's a man next to it. You can see it's a huge piece. Plaster of Paris, I guess. I'm not sure what it was made of. That's just what it looks like to me, but highly accurate model. And when we get closer here and see the fine detail that is in this thing, you start to see more and more craters. Look at all the subtle craters in there. This is all accurate. Look, they're showing how accurate it is. See, we're very impressed. But here is being used for the LOLA simulator, and it looks very similar to the footage captured by the Apollo camera on the official Apollo landing. And now look at the subtle detail. You can see craters and things. We will get close here. This is a model. We'll zoom in close. Look, there are tiny rocks, all kinds of subtle detail happening in this thing. And if you made the model 4 times as large, imagine the detail you could put in it. You could put sands on it, add a few fake rocks on it. The sand would move. Look at this huge set, a huge model rather. 2 guys at the bottom standing next to it. I don't know what this was used for, but look, it's an example of a big model. And then use the setup. This is the same space that they were using for the set. They wouldn't have room to fit that giant model world that they built. In some cases, I think the rover was moved on a giant hydraulic stand. They had a fake front setup with a camera setup. I don't think necessarily it was in view, but it was used to generate shadows on the surface. So here, I think these photos were generated from a DAC camera. You can see in the middle one, there's a shadow of the antenna and camera. Sometimes it's because the shadows, some because they're on a set. But I believe they had a rig to generate shadows, so that when they projected it on a screen in front of the simulator, it had a shadow to make you think they're really there. Here's another example you can see, but it's rare, right? All of these images, but they only have one shadow, so it's quite possible they take 1 frame at a time. It's just got a shadow in it. Fiber optics are used in the cameras. Possibly they had endoscopic kind of setup with the camera, and instead of doing this, like they did in Star Wars, you have these guys coming and going and animating. The camera animated. In fact, you'll hear Douglas Trumbull a bit describe how they did it on Back to the Future ride. I had no idea that they could do that, and no doubt he implemented something like that in the Apollo simulation, whatever they call the hoax. So instead of guys doing this, they had cameras. And maybe they had something in their bag of tricks. Move the antenna so that it projected the proper shadow. Here I am showing an example. This is footage generated by filming of the models. A computer model, but it's an example nonetheless. Here we are in the simulated ride in front of the footage with no movement. And now we're going to use the same footage, and we're going to add a very simple movement, kind of like we saw in the rover simulator. And there's the rig moving a little bit. That's what's generating the image at the top. And here we're going to add a little extra little move. We're adding pops and stuff. And here you'll see that extra movement. It's not added to the original footage. I have been doing these as separate so you can see them as separate. Here we have a loose camera, as if it's on a stand that's reacting to the movement of the rover. And you'll see how it all comes together. This is the basic movement, the left image at the top. And now we will add what I call gross movement, where it's all kind of moving in and out of craters. Now we have the smaller movement, and it's a little extra. And here's where they loosened up the camera a bit. It's on its stem, it's reaching to the rig, and now we're on the moon. It's pretty extraordinary how simple it is and how effective it is. And now you can even see the reflections in the antenna up there. I believe they probably had a 360-degree setup for any kind of reflections, and that's not that much more difficult. Let's look at the actual footage here. I'm not going to show it all to you, but you can see more in the appendix. It's quite extensive. I think it would be interesting in having someone go through and really nail down what is what. But I think that's, well, not necessary here. And this is why. There are a lot of things that landed on the moon, a lot of unmanned things. The rovers went pretty far. There are a lot of opportunities to see what the moon should look like. And when stitched together, I can tell you what the moon should look like. So those flipping through real quick are either low frame rate DAC or Hasselblad photos from the chest camera. So here, I stabilize these. It's amazing how unbearable it is to watch the actual footage. It'll drive you insane it's shaking so much. I minimized the shaking a lot here. It had to be done by hand because the tracker doesn't like tracking this crap. But you can see it looks very similar to what I just showed you in regards to the virtual set of the simulator ride. See that shadow in the lower right? This could be a setup. I believe this is a section of the set, the previous one, if you look at this clip. And when you look at the whole clip, I believe sometimes they mixed how they did it. Sometimes they filmed it with a model, sometimes they filmed it on a set. They used the same rover, actually, that was on a set. They put it on a rig. Up here it looks like it's on a set, but it's hard to tell. You don't see any shadows of the astronaut on the ground, the other astronaut sitting in the rover, and the reflections are just the landscape. So I think it's quite possible that this is fake footage, meaning they're not on a set. And this is all reacting to the motion-controlled camera that they have on it. There's nothing about this footage that says, you know, the landscape, so it's actual. There's no detail in here, so you can't see the detail, it's all limited. The other thing about this footage is that it is transferred to HD. Thank you very much. It should be transferred into log, to digital format, so that we can analyze it for ourselves. Perhaps somebody else could get that to happen. And there's a shadow on the ground. Either that was on a set, quite possible. They're kind of going in circles or actually done on a model. So the modules all landed on the moon? Well, they have footage of it. These were all captured models. I believe it was a model with sand on it, certainly where the module landed. And it was all filmed slowly, except for the landing part, when they had a simulator action, just like the simulator, and blasted sand. And after the sand cleared, they did a mixture with masks and stuff, which dissolves to the actual set. Practical, life-size set you see in the film of the astronauts walking around. Here we have Apollo 14 and landing on its model. And it's not going very far. You can see that it's a curved model. It is accurate to the curvature of the moon, so it's very accurate. It's very similar to the model we just looked at for the LRV. All the craters, same thing, highly accurate. Here's something interesting though. You can see some striation lines. I put some lines on to show you, well, the angle, and they look just like the mosaic lines, satellites flying over, around and around, catching images, and they put them together. And here you can see the striation lines. It's hard to avoid when that's your only reference when you build the model. Look here, it's very clear. Increase the contrast to make it a little more clear, but there they are. Striation lines are what they are. These are the mosaic images, and here we are coming in for a landing. It's all sped up compared to the real landing. It's in real time. And you can see the sand now. Fortunately, in 14, the sand did not obliterate the view so clearly, so they didn't have an opportunity to do a good blend. And the giveaway. The give is the crater shadows. They change, as well as the shapes of the surface a bit. The crater shadows is more obvious here. Now we're analyzing that. The camera is supposedly located in the filming through the triangular windows. I believe it's the one on the left of the door, in this view from the outside, and it's coming in upside down kind of. It's all odd, so I had to turn the image so that you can see, well, the reference. The framing is the reference. And here we're coming in. You can see the actual sand blasting, but you can always see the craters. The thing is, the two right in the middle there, you can see just above the middle, and the shadows have changed. Here they are, the shadows, so you can keep an eye on them. And see the two shadows there? It's pretty dark, and here the shadows are shallow. It's not so clear to the uninitiated eye, but for me, it is fairly obvious. Those are deep shadows, very dark, very clear. It's not just an illusion. And here it's just got a little shadow, and zoom in to make it a little more obvious. Now that's very detailed. Now I'll demonstrate how this was done. So here are the craters. We have the two examples of what appears not to be an illusion. Slight sun angle changes, right? In one, the shadows are really low in the crater, and the other, the shadows are higher in the crater. In fact, you see it all in the craters there, but not in the top one. You really don't see it because they change that quickly. It's just a soft map. It's just, I'm sure, covered with dust to hide it. So I go back and forth. You can see them all. The surface shifts a little bit because it doesn't match up. It's very difficult to have a scale model which is smaller, one life size, to match up. That's quite a feat, but it does accomplish the effect, right? Just look at all the other footage for evidence of that. Every other one, the other 5, the sand completely obliterates the view. And then when it clears, we're on the set. Maybe they claim this is gas distortion, rocket blast, but it doesn't quite work with me. There's a lot of distortions taking place which we'll review. If we look below over there, we can see how this was done. They had 2 different setups, all on computer, 2 different setups going on, model setup. The lighting is quite different the way they had it set up. And when the scene shifts, they're using the same model, the same setup, and shifted a little bit, so here's the difference. You can see the shadows are different, the gray area I shifted a little, just subtle, and how I blurred the model. Obscured by dust, right? This is a little more accurate to the differences. Now here the moon is blasted by dust, right? Fake sand, of course, on top of it, and used it as a mat. So they did all this by hand for the most part, but now I use it as a mat. You'll see the fluctuation. It's used to disguise the distortion taking place, and simply because they are spraying sand out of a nozzle at the bottom. Had this been real, the sand would still be lingering about. This is not what we are seeing here. There's another discrepancy here. That's because one was a model and one was a life size. There's a change occurring here on the detail. I'm not quite sure what it is, as it fades in and then fades out again. But there is no reason for this thing to be changing like this. It's changing shape. I think Douglas Trumbull is likely the mastermind behind this. He was the 2001 Space Odyssey visual effects mastermind, and he had a lot of experience in this, simulating the moon and space stuff. His first job was with graphic films and working for Apollo, generating PR stuff for Apollo. To the Moon and Beyond is something he generated with Cinerama, and it was used as the technology backdrop. Here's some information about To the Moon. It's a large film format, really longer than other formats, and it's extraordinary what they did on Space Odyssey 2001. There is evidence that it was supported by NASA, and it was a kind of an R&D to figure out all the technology. They used it for the Apollo hoax. And it's also in the interest to see he worked for the Apollo program already, before he did 2001. Again, it was a large format with the use of a fisheye lens and immersive cinema. That is, immersive cinema before the Apollo program. So he was already interested in it. It's quite extraordinary how his career parallels the ability to do all of the special effects needed to pull off this hoax. Let's hear him tell us in his own words.
I'll get into it right away, and I'm going to take it pretty much chronologically, so I think it'll make a certain amount of sense. When I was just out of high school, I was going to be an architect, I thought, and I started taking courses in illustration and painting and mechanical drawing and engineering drawing and things like that. I became very fascinated with kind of science fiction illustration, and it was all multiplane photography, fisheye lenses projected into a dome theater, and photographed with fisheye lenses and wide-angle lenses projected with fisheye lenses into a kind of a planetarium dome theater. And the show was called To the Moon and Beyond. And Stanley Kubrick and Arthur Clarke saw this show, which I had done all the illustrations for, which were part of the multiplane photography. And Graphic Films got a job to start doing some preliminary early design work for 2001: A Space Odyssey, which at the time was called Journey Beyond the Stars in a very early draft. This is one of my early pencil sketches for a kind of a lunar base. You can see some similarity here to, the horizon on the moon, the Earth in the distance, various kinds of lunar modules and stuff like that. An idea for a pod, which became like a pod in 2001. But I wanted to digress a little bit. So 2001, you have a little storyboard drawing. A lot of storyboard drawings we work with are very simple, sketches almost, but you see shots in the movie, and then you see the moon bus, and that was one of my first tasks on 2001 as a young man. I was probably maybe 24, starting to detail these miniatures and trying to make them look photorealistic, even though they were just fiberglass models with not much detail. And we started figuring out how to put detail and painting. And actually, since I was an illustrator, I was actually painting with my airbrush right on the model to create different panels of texture and brightness and reflection and trying to make it look as big as we possibly could. And then I got involved in shooting some of these miniatures. Kubrick really got to like me and what I was able to do, and so I got into designing some of these shots like this, where each of these was a 1,000-watt light bulb out of a slide projector, and this was the painting back here, and this is the moon bus that's going to land, and it's mounted on this rod back here. It's kind of tilting up and down, has nitrogen coming through the nozzles of the supposedly jet engines or rocket engines to stir up all this dust, and we had to mount it on glass in order to superimpose one thing against another. So you get shots like this, shots like this. You can see all this little detail and stuff that I got involved in creating little, streaks of grease and who knows what to try to make it look real. This is working on the big stage, one of the big stages at MGM. That's the space station set over here and the moon bus set over here. This is the moon bus set being built. Several shots of that. I designed a lot of these moon terrains. I had a lot of discussions with Stanley about what we thought the moon was going to look like, because nobody knew. There hadn't been any satellites or anything that really had looked at the moon's surface in any detail. And so this was kind of a Chesley Bonestell, rocky, craggy terrain kind of thing that he wanted. And I was actually going in another direction, which did not make the cut. And here's me working on my moon terrain, which I thought was, in fact, in retrospect, very much like what the moon is like. It's very rounded, very soft, very eroded by micrometeorite impacts, and not craggy at all. These are some early designs for the Jupiter sequence. The Discovery spacecraft went through a zillion different iterations. The Stargate was going to be a slot inside one of Jupiter's moons that they go into. This was actually a very early hypothetical rendering of what the pod might look like at a very early stage. This slot in one of Jupiter's moons was going to be another little universe down there that didn't belong in our universe, and they had to go down there. And these are like two pods looking down here. They're going to send little probes down. There's a whole bunch of things that were designed, written, experimented with, drawn, discussed, and deleted. This movie went through tremendous development. So The thing I'm talking about today is all the whole kind of creative process of how you tackle a problem, work on it, discuss it, solve it, change it, and try to come up with a new solution to make something on the screen that people have not seen before. So anyway, ShowScan was this 60-frame, 70-millimeter giant screen thing that was way better than Cinerama and way better than IMAX in 1975. The simulation ride was this whole idea of hydraulic motion base and a capsule with people inside, which I'll show you later, became the Back to the Future ride for me, which was a lot of fun. And then another ride called Cineride, which never came to pass, which was really cool, and I'm sure we're going to do this pretty soon, was projecting multiple ShowScan films in a dark ride situation, and you're in a vehicle. And we filmed these films knowing that the vehicle would be moving at 30 feet a second, or 30 feet a minute. And so we filmed it with the camera moving 30 feet a minute and projected these films into domes, and then had foreground sets that were all moving in perspective to the perspective shift in the movie, and it was all 60 frame. And it was so real that everybody believed that everything that they were seeing was happening in real time, including explosions, breakaway glass, mummies, monsters, you name it. It was really wild. We started developing special electronic 70-millimeter projectors that could run 60 frames a second electronically, did not have a mechanical Geneva movement in them. One of the things this ShowScan thing led to was an experimental film, which I'm sorry I can't show you, but we knew the size and shape of the screen. And so I devised this thing. I said, well, if we shoot in ShowScan and we project it in exact same scale as the theater itself, I'm going to do this illusion. And so we had this scene where we projected a really bad movie on the screen that was kind of a fake documentary, and we made everything go wrong that you could possibly think of. It goes out of frame, it goes out of focus, the film burns in the gate, it's just terrible, and it fails. Then the projectionist leaves the projection booth, goes around the theater, comes behind the screen, turns on a work light back there, because screens are perforated, you can see through them. If there was a light back there, you'd see the speakers behind the screen. So he does that, and so you see the speakers in there, there's this big roll-up door, there's a door he comes through, and he comes up to the audience and touches the screen, which is catching the light from these house lights, and starts talking to the audience, apologizing for screwing up the show. It looked absolutely real. It was indistinguishable from reality. And his feet are on the ground, and he's 6 feet tall, and it was all in scale to my theater. And heavyweight people like Steven Spielberg and George Lucas and Coppola, everybody came to my screenings. And when I would get to this point, they would get up out of their seat and start leaving the theater, shaking my hand, say, Doug, whenever you get it fixed, give me a call. I'll see if I can get it in my schedule to come back. And it wasn't until they were off to the side of the theater they realized they'd been completely fooled. And this, to me, was a really important moment in movie history. And this little movie called New Magic has actually been requested by the Academy to be archived there. And I'm hoping we can get it digitally scanned so we can show it again in high definition. Now we're working on an entry-level version of this, which will enable film students and colleges to do this kind of thing very inexpensively. And I'm working with a guy named Scott Lismondi at Hollywood General Machining, and building a zero-gravity boom out of a porta-jib components. And this is under construction in LA right now, and we're just about to test it right after Christmas. And it's a really cool thing. This whole little gizmo, I can't use the word gizmo, device is going to cost about $5,000 instead of the original one that cost $250,000. So I've also been experimenting with digital single-lens reflex cameras, which are quite amazing. If you've ever shot with a Nikon or a Canon, I'm using the Canon 7D with some Zacuto attachments. It's a very inexpensive camera. It's shooting full high definition 1K by 2K 24 frame movies very inexpensively. And I'm having good results with it. And my next step is I'm going to tear this camera apart and pull the chip out and build it into a new camera that will be able to be 2 chips side by side for a integrated 3D camera. Now, in the world right now, the Red camera is the hot camera. It's not the only camera, but it's a good kind of mid-level priced camera. And I think we can start adapting this for 3D production as well, because the 3D cameras we're seeing these days are really cumbersome, awkward, and heavy, like the IMAX cameras have been and like the Cinerama cameras were. So we're in an early phase of 3D where shooting in 3D is a real pain in the neck. but it's going to get much better. Right now, I went to NAB just a few months ago in Las Vegas and saw all the latest 3D camera rigs. I got to tell you, it's horrible because these cameras are clumsy, noisy, fat, heavy, obtrusive, hard to align. They create all kinds of horrendous post-production problems to composite 3D live action. And we're in our infancy of trying to solve a lot of these technical problems to try to make a whole new generation of 3D cameras and solve these problems so that shooting in 3D is not such a pain in the neck. I've been recently working with Terry Malick on Tree of Life. He won't let me talk about it. I think it's going to come out pretty soon. There's one shot I'll show you, just a little hint. There's me. There's a Phantom camera shooting at 1,000 frames a second in a vat of water. You can imagine how much paint or milk or whatever might have been in there. And we're designing one version of that film, which is called The Voyage of Time, which is going to be in IMAX theaters in about a year after that, which is going to be this spectacular space experience, probably the closest thing to 2001 since then. And so we've been studying IMAX theaters, geometry, screens, projection. And this whole digital virtual studio I'm working on, which I want to do with my next film, is to build a stage that's designed with the zero gravity boom. And everything is designed around that technology to automate the lighting grid so that we can do rehearsals on this and pre-light scenes and come back into our stage and reshoot. I'm even, hypothetically designing what a studio might look like if you did a whole bunch of these stages. There's a lot of advantages of the zero gravity crane, digital cameras, automated lighting, very limited sets, a very smaller stage, a smaller crew, faster shooting, increased production value, and lower costs. So there's a lot of benefits to working this way. So I'm working on this whole idea. I'm writing screenplays for this technology, and we hope to kind of clone this and make it happen all over the world. We have to get funding. I'm not going to go through this. It's more like a business presentation. It's okay if you call me a mad scientist.
So the question is, who is behind this? Well, to start with, there's Mission Control, but almost no one was behind this. They were fooled along with us. There were perhaps a few agents in there. The only people talking to the people on the moon were the astronauts themselves. They were the ones that did all of the talking to the supposed astronauts on the moon. And that's not a real moon, by the way. And I believe that they were in the suits in the footage that we see, and they've been lying to us ever since. And not everyone in this picture landed on the moon, but I believe they were all involved one way or another, and someone could investigate that further. But in Mission Control, there were astronauts there, and they were the only ones that were allowed to talk to the astronauts. This is a camera controller. He is involved too, because obviously he's not the one controlling the camera. I suspect that he was possibly or probably involved in the fake footage camera movement. Why not? So, what is NASA? Is NASA real? I believe it is actually an Intel operation with a fake front. Intel likes to do this. You can say it was infiltrated, but I believe it was designed to be fake. In fact, all of them are. The entire space program is a front. Such companies say, yes, we're here for humanity, and yes, we put people in space, but no, we're putting spy satellites over the planet, trying to control the planet. It's an age-old technique of owning the sky. Yes, we try to communicate with the heavens, but we are in communication with the gods. Apollo is supposedly the god of light. NASA is not. So without Apollo, what is NASA? Apollo isn't real. It's nothing but a ghost.